He had exactly $43 left in his wallet and a 7-year-old girl who still believed everything was going to be fine. Ethan Walker had survived 3 combat deployments, 2 years in Fallujah, and a marriage that ended with a voicemail. He had never once told himself the situation was hopeless. But standing outside the warehouse that had just handed him a termination letter, with Lily's hand in his, her backpack shaped like a ladybug, her shoes lighting up pink with every step, he felt something close to it. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let's see how far this one travels. The termination letter was printed on company letterhead, which Ethan thought was a strange touch. Like they'd dressed it up so it wouldn't feel so bad going down. He read it twice in the parking lot, standing next to his truck, while Lily sat on the wheel well picking at a loose rubber seal and humming something she'd heard on the radio that morning. The letter said restructuring. It said position elimination. It said we wish you the best in your future endeavors, which was the kind of sentence that meant absolutely nothing while pretending to mean something generous. He folded it in thirds and put it in his jacket pocket. Dad? Lily looked up. Are we going? Yeah. He pulled open the passenger door. We're going. She climbed in without ceremony, buckling her own seatbelt the way she'd insisted on doing since she turned 6, taking the task very seriously, double-checking the click. He walked around to the driver's side and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel before starting the engine. The drive home took 11 minutes. He counted. Sam. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like dryer sheets near the laundry room and old carpet everywhere else. It was clean. Ethan kept it clean. He'd learned that much from the Navy, that your environment reflected your discipline, and discipline was the only thing you could control when everything else was falling apart. The dishes were always done, Lily's clothes were always folded, the refrigerator was organized by what needed to be used first. He checked it when they got home. 2 eggs, half a block of cheese, a nearly empty jar of pasta sauce, a wilting head of lettuce that wasn't going to make it another day. He stood with the refrigerator door open for longer than he should have. Can we have pizza? Lily called from the living room. She'd already dropped her backpack and was lying on the floor with her shoes still on, which she knew the rules about. Shoes, he said. A pause. The sound of Velcro tearing open. Can we, though? He closed the refrigerator. He opened his wallet and counted, which he hadn't let himself do since Tuesday. $43 and some change. His last paycheck had covered rent, the electric bill, and a 2-week bus pass for Lily's after-school program. There was nothing else coming in, not until he found something new, and finding something new was not a same-day kind of problem. Sure, he said. We can do that. The pizza place 2 blocks over was called Carmine's, and it had been there since before either of them existed. The booths were red vinyl, cracked along the seams, patched in places with electrical tape that had since been painted over. The owner was a heavy-set man named Paul, who recognized Lily and always brought her a small cup of ginger ale without being asked. They sat in the corner booth. You're quiet, Lily said. She was studying the laminated menu even though she always ordered the same thing. Just tired. She looked at him over the top of the menu. She had her mother's eyes, which was something Ethan had never figured out how to feel about, whether it was a comfort or whether it was a reminder of a different kind. Hazel, with a darker ring around the outside. Watchful. Was it a bad day? She asked. It was a day. That means yes. He almost smiled. Order your pizza, Lily. She set the menu down flat on the table, very deliberately, the way she did when she was about to say something she'd already decided on. I can eat cereal for dinner sometimes, if we need to save money. He looked at her. 7 years old, and she understood enough to be willing to give something up. He didn't know whether to be proud of her or devastated by it. We're not at cereal for dinner yet, he said. Order your pizza. She picked the menu back up. Cheese and mushroom. I know. Paul came over with the ginger ale unprompted, and Ethan ordered a medium to split and a water for himself. And when Paul walked away, Lily drank half her ginger ale in one long pull through the paper straw and said, I think Mr. Patterson gives too much homework. How much did he give? 3 pages of math and a reading thing. That's not too much. It is, though. They argued about it pleasantly, the way they had learned to argue about small things, Not to resolve anything, just to have something to push against. It was the closest thing Ethan had to normal conversation most days. He didn't have many friends left. His unit had scattered after discharge, the way those things went. A few guys he texted occasionally, one he'd had a beer with twice in the last 2 years. His marriage had taken most of the mutual connections with it when it ended. His life, since he'd come home and taken custody of Lily, had narrowed itself down to her and work and the space between those two things. He was okay with that. He told himself he was okay with that. The pizza came and they ate, and it was good, and Lily got sauce on her chin and wiped it with her sleeve before he could hand her a napkin, which was a battle he'd long since given up on. Walking home, Lily took his hand. She still did that. Not always, not in front of her friends at school, but when it was just the two of them and the street was quiet. He was aware of how much time he had left before she stopped doing it entirely, and he didn't think about that directly if he could help it. They took the long way home because Lily wanted to walk through Calder Park, which had a path that curved past a small pond and a row of old oak trees that were finally starting to hold their leaves again after a long winter. The park was mostly empty at that hour. A few joggers, a man walking a dog that was trying very hard to sniff everything simultaneously, a couple on a bench near the water sharing earbuds. Lily spotted the woman first. "Dad." Her hand tightened slightly in his. Not from fear, more like she was directing his attention the way she sometimes did when she saw something she couldn't explain. The woman was sitting alone on a bench near the eastern path, the one that got less foot traffic because it didn't loop back to the main entrance. She wasn't moving. She had on a coat that was too thin for the temperature, dark with grime along the collar, and she was hunched slightly, arms crossed over her chest. A paper bag sat at her feet. She was looking at the ground. People were walking past her, not around her exactly. They weren't giving her a wide berth the way people sometimes did. They were just walking past without looking. She wasn't in anyone's way, so she didn't register as anything that required a response. Ethan slowed down. He'd been trained in threat assessment, which meant he'd also been trained in its opposite, in reading a situation for what it actually was rather than what it might become. What he saw was a woman who was cold and alone and had not eaten recently from the way she was holding herself. He saw someone who had stopped expecting anyone to stop. "Can we help her?" Lily asked. She said it quietly, not performing concern, just asking. Ethan looked at his wallet in his mind. $43. Pizza had been about 16. He had roughly 27 left, and $27 was not nothing, but it was also not enough to matter much over the next several weeks of job searching. He thought about that for approximately 2 seconds. "Yeah," he said. "Come on." There was a food cart about half a block back near the park entrance, one of those carts that sold hot sandwiches and soup during the colder months. The operator was a middle-aged Haitian man who played soft music from a small Bluetooth speaker and moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing the same thing for years. The sandwiches were better than they had any right to be. Ethan bought a turkey and Swiss on sourdough, a container of tomato soup, and a coffee. The cart guy packed it in a brown bag with napkins. When they walked back to the bench, the woman didn't look up immediately. She heard their footsteps approach and her shoulders tightened slightly. A small defensive movement, automatic. "Hey," Ethan said. He didn't walk up too close. He stopped a few feet away, the way you'd stop for a dog you weren't sure about, giving her space. "We got extra from the cart. You want it?" She looked up. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe late 20s, early 30s. Her face was angular, with dark circles under her eyes, and a quality about her expression that he recognized from people who'd been awake too long or had simply been through something. She looked at him and then at Lily, and something shifted slightly in her face, not softened exactly, more like she recalibrated. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," Ethan said. He held out the bag. She took it after a moment, and he sat down on the other end of the bench, not hovering, not making a production of it, just sitting, the way you sat on a bench because you were tired. Lily climbed up between them with the easy unself-consciousness of a child who hadn't yet learned to perform normalcy. "What's your name?" Lily asked. The woman looked at her. "Victoria." "I'm Lily. That's my dad. He was in the Navy." "Lily," Ethan said. "What?" "He was." Victoria almost smiled. It didn't quite complete, but it started to. She opened the bag and looked inside, and something crossed her face that Ethan couldn't quite name. Not gratitude exactly, more like she was processing something she hadn't expected. "How long have you been out here?" Ethan asked. Not prying, just asking, the way you asked someone how they were doing on a job site when you actually meant it. "Few hours," she said. He nodded. He didn't push. He sat with her while she ate, and Lily filled the silence with a detailed account of Mr. Patterson's excessive homework policy, and Victoria listened, and the park got a little darker, and the temperature dropped another degree or two, and at some point Victoria finished the soup and wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and seemed, in some small way, less rigid than she'd been when they found her. When Ethan stood to leave, he looked at her and said, "You good?" "Yeah," she said. "I'm good." He didn't ask for anything. He didn't give her a card or a speech. He just nodded and took Lily's hand, and they walked back toward home, the lights in Lily's shoes blinking pink against the path. "Is she going to be okay?" Lily asked once they were past the pond. "I think so," Ethan said. "Do you actually think so, or are you just saying that?" He thought about it for a real moment. "I actually think so." Lily seemed to accept this. She swung their joined hands once, twice. A bird called somewhere in the dark above the trees. "We spent our last money, didn't we?" she said. It wasn't really a question. He didn't answer right away. "We've still got eggs," he said. Lily considered this. "I like eggs." "I know you do." "Dad?" "Yeah." "I'm glad we stopped." He looked down at her, the side of her face, the small, serious line of her mouth. He thought about the letter folded in his pocket. He thought about tomorrow's job search and the week after that, and all the phone calls he was going to have to make, and the pride he was going to have to shelve, because pride was a luxury, and right now he couldn't afford the interest on it. "Me too," he said. They walked the rest of the way in silence, and the night was cold, and their breath made small clouds in the air in front of them, and somewhere behind them in the park, a woman sat alone on a bench in the dark, holding a cup of coffee that was still warm. The eggs lasted 2 days. Ethan scrambled them the first morning with the last of the cheese, and Lily ate her portion without complaint and drank her orange juice and went to school with her ladybug backpack and her light-up shoes. And he stood at the kitchen window watching her disappear around the corner at the end of the block, and then turned back to a kitchen that was very quiet and very empty, in a way that apartments get when the one person who fills them up has just left. He made himself a list. That was the first thing. Always make the list, because the list turned a problem into a set of smaller problems, and smaller problems could be worked. He sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote down everything he needed to do in the next 30 days. Rent was covered. Electric was covered. The after-school program billing came on the 15th, and he had until then to figure something out. Groceries were the immediate problem. His truck payment was in 3 weeks, and the truck was not optional. Without it, he couldn't get to interviews, couldn't pick Lily up if the after-school ran late, couldn't function. He looked at the list for a while. Then he opened his laptop and started sending applications. What? He had a system, which was the only thing that kept it from feeling like screaming into a void. He divided his search into 3 categories: logistics and operations management, which was his most direct experience, security consulting, which used his military background, and anything adjacent that paid enough to matter. He sent 12 applications that first day. He sent 9 the second. He put on a clean shirt and drove to 2 in-person interviews at warehouses on the south side of the city, places that had posted for operations supervisors, and sat across from HR managers who looked at his resume and made the face people made when they were impressed, but also slightly uncomfortable with what they didn't understand. One of them asked him what his biggest weakness was. He thought about saying something honest, like, "I have difficulty delegating when I don't trust the process," which was true, but said instead that he sometimes held himself to a standard that he needed to learn to extend to his teams, which was also true and considerably easier for an HR manager to digest. He didn't get either job. The rejections came by email, both of them on the same Thursday afternoon, and he read them at the kitchen table while Lily was doing homework beside him, her tongue pressed to the corner of her lip the way it got when she was concentrating, her pencil moving in slow, deliberate loops across the math worksheet. He closed his laptop. "You okay?" she asked without looking up. "Fine." She looked up. "You did the thing with your jaw." "What thing?" The tight thing. You do it when you're stressed. He made a deliberate effort to unclench his jaw. I didn't know I did that. You do it a lot, she said, and went back to her worksheet. He sat there for a moment and thought about what it meant that his 7-year-old daughter had cataloged his stress responses and decided not to examine it too closely right now. The groceries came from the food pantry on Meridian Street, which he found after spending 20 minutes on his phone reading the requirements and then another 10 minutes sitting in his truck in the parking lot before going in. The woman at the intake desk was named Carol, and she was matter-of-fact about the whole thing in a way that he appreciated. No excessive sympathy, no careful gentleness, just a form to fill out and a cart to push, and a set of shelves with more food on them than he'd expected. He came home with pasta, canned tomatoes, peanut butter, bread, rice, and a bag of apples that Lily immediately claimed as her personal property. He didn't tell her where the food came from. She didn't ask. Maybe she knew. She was perceptive enough to know, but she was also perceptive enough to understand when not to ask a question, which was something he hadn't taught her and wasn't sure how she'd learned. That night, he made pasta with canned tomato sauce, and they sat at the table and Lily told him about a girl at school named Priya who had a hamster named Senator and who had brought Senator in for show and tell, and Senator had escaped from his cage and hidden inside the art supply cabinet for 45 minutes before anyone found him. And by the time she finished the story, she was laughing so hard she had to set her fork down. And Ethan sat across from her and watched her laugh, and felt something in his chest that was not quite happiness, but was adjacent to it, was grateful for it. He put the dishes away and checked his job alerts one more time before bed. Nothing new. On the 8th day after losing the job, a Monday, he got a call from a number he didn't recognize. He was in his truck outside the library, using their Wi-Fi from the parking lot because it was faster than his apartment connection, and when he answered, he was already braced for a spam call or a survey. "Is this Ethan Walker?" A woman's voice, precise, unhurried. "Speaking." "My name is Dana Reeves. I'm calling from the executive recruitment team at Arcturus Logistics. We'd like to invite you in for a preliminary interview for a regional operations role." He pulled the phone slightly away from his face and looked at it for a second, as if that would tell him something. "I applied to Arcturus," he said. "Online. Last week." "Yes," Dana said. "Your profile came through our talent pipeline. The position is Regional Operations Director. It's a senior leadership role. We'd want to start with a preliminary conversation. Nothing formal, just a chance to understand your background and your fit for the team." He knew Arcturus Logistics. Everyone in the industry knew Arcturus. They'd grown from a regional freight company into one of the largest third-party logistics operators in the country in about 5 years, which was the kind of growth that made industry people talk. He also knew that Regional Operations Director was not the kind of title he'd applied for. He'd applied for an operations manager position, a mid-level role. "What level of experience are you looking for, Chase?" he asked. "Leadership at scale," Dana said. "Military background is considered an asset. Do you have availability this week?" He looked at his calendar, which was empty. "Wednesday works," he said. He didn't tell Lily about the interview because he'd learned that telling her about things before he knew whether they would happen created a specific kind of disappointed silence that was worse than not having mentioned them. She'd lived through enough of his near misses over the past year. A contract security job that fell through when the client restructured, a logistics coordinator role that got eliminated before his start date, that she'd developed her own version of cautious optimism, which looked a lot like saying nothing and watching him. He borrowed a tie from his neighbor Marcus, a retired postal worker who lived in 3B and had 3 ties in his closet that hadn't been touched in years. Marcus gave him the blue one and told him he looked like he meant business, and then told him he needed to iron the collar of his shirt, and then ironed it himself because Ethan's iron was apparently running too hot, and Marcus had opinions about collar irons. "You know what the trick is in interviews?" Marcus said, running the iron along the collar with practiced precision. "What?" "You talk to them like you're deciding if you want the job, not like you need it." "That's easier to do when you don't need it." Marcus set the iron down. "Everybody needs something. Doesn't mean you have to let them see how much." He held up the shirt. "There. Now you look like a director of whatever." The Arcturus Logistics headquarters occupied the top 4 floors of a glass building downtown, the kind of building with a lobby that cost more to design than most buildings cost to build. The elevator required a key card to access the executive floors, and the receptionist who met Ethan in the lobby had the kind of professional warmth that high-end corporate offices trained for, the smile that was genuine but also calibrated. She took him to a conference room with a long table and windows that faced the city. There was water on the table, and a notepad, and a pen with the Arcturus logo on it. He sat down and waited. Dana Reeves turned out to be a woman in her mid-40s, with reading glasses on a chain and the particular composure of someone who had been in HR for long enough that nothing surprised her. She sat across from him with a printed copy of his resume, actually printed, which he noticed, and spent the first 10 minutes asking him about his Navy service. Not the expected questions, not the heroic stuff. She wanted to know how he'd managed teams under stress, how he'd handled equipment failures in the field, whether he'd ever had to make a decision that hurt morale in the short term because it was the right call long term. He answered her directly, without embellishment. He told her about a situation in his second deployment where he'd had to pull a man from a role he was good at because the team's safety required someone with a different specific skill set in that position. He told her it hadn't gone over well and that he'd had to live with the fallout from it and that the decision had still been correct. He told her he didn't always like the decisions he had to make. Dana made notes. She had a way of listening that was active without being performative. She didn't nod constantly or make encouraging sounds. She just listened and occasionally wrote something down. The role we're interviewing for, she said after a while, oversees operations across 3 regional hubs, about 240 direct staff, plus contract labor. There have been some significant structural challenges in the past 18 months. Efficiency gaps, communication failures between hub leadership and corporate. The person in this role needs to be able to diagnose what's actually happening on the ground, not just read the reports. Walk the floor, Ethan said. Exactly. What happened to the last director? Dana paused just a fraction of a second. He was better at reporting the numbers than understanding why they were what they were. Ethan nodded. He understood that completely. He'd worked for people like that, people who were fluent in metrics and illiterate in the actual work. The warehouse where he'd just lost his job had been managed by committee consensus for so long that no one in leadership had been on the floor during a full shift in over a year. He'd known it. He'd flagged it. They'd appreciated his concern and done nothing with it. What would the timeline look like, he asked. There are additional evaluation stages, Dana said. We take hiring at this level seriously. It wouldn't be a quick process. That's fine, he said, meaning it. When he left the building an hour later and walked to where his truck was parked 3 blocks over, he sat inside it for a moment with the key in his hand. It had gone well. He thought it had gone well. He was also aware that he had thought that before and been wrong, and that the difference between feeling good about something and it actually happening was a space where a lot of men had found themselves humbled. He drove home, picked Lily up from after school, made rice and canned soup for dinner. What Ethan Walker did not know, and had no reason to suspect, was that the woman on the bench in Calder Park had not been homeless. Victoria Sterling, and it was Victoria Sterling, the same Victoria Sterling whose name appeared on the Arcturus Logistics corporate website as founder and chief executive officer, had spent 14 hours that day sitting in 4 different locations around the city, a bus stop on the east side, a subway platform downtown, a food court in a mall, and finally the park bench where evening found her. She'd eaten nothing since breakfast. She'd left her phone and her wallet and her credentials at her apartment that morning, taken a company-issued vehicle registered to a subsidiary, and gone out to see what happened. The experiment had started as something she'd read about, the idea of removing yourself from the identity that made people treat you a certain way and observing what remained. She'd expected it to be interesting. She hadn't expected it to be quite so conclusive. In 14 hours, no one had offered her food. No one had offered her water. 3 people had told her she couldn't sit where she was sitting. 1 security guard had followed her out of the mall. A woman had crossed the street to avoid walking near her at the bus stop. And then a man with a 7-year-old girl, and from the look of his jacket and his truck and the careful way he counted what he spent at the food cart, very little money to spare, that man had stopped, had bought her a hot meal, had sat beside her without condescension or visible discomfort, had let his daughter talk to her like she was a person who deserved to have a conversation. Victoria had sat on that bench for 20 minutes after they left, in the cold, drinking the coffee he'd bought her. She was not, by her own assessment, a sentimental person. She'd built a company from a cargo broker's license and borrowed office space, had fired people who needed to be fired and taken losses that needed to be taken, had made decisions that kept her up at night and made them anyway because the alternative was worse. Sentiment was something she understood the value of and tried not to mistake for strategy. But she thought about that man, the way he'd held the bag out without a speech, the way he'd said, "I know," when she told him he didn't have to. She'd spent a decade making assessments of people, investors, executives, potential hires, partners, and she had a particular sensitivity to the distance between how people presented themselves and who they actually were under pressure. That man had nothing, and he'd stopped anyway without making it about himself, without requiring her gratitude, without extracting any visible satisfaction from having done a good thing. That was character. The kind that didn't know it was being observed, which was the only reliable kind. She got home at 9:30 that night and took a long shower and ate a bowl of cereal standing over the kitchen sink, and before she went to bed she wrote a name on a notepad on her desk. Not a full plan, not yet, just the name, Ethan Walker. Finding him was not difficult. She had resources that made finding people straightforward, and she was also careful about how she used them. She wasn't interested in surveillance, only in understanding whether what she'd seen in the park held up when you looked closer. She ran a professional background search through the company's standard vetting service, which pulled his military record, his work history, his public professional profiles. What she found was consistent in a way that was genuinely rare. His Navy record showed 8 years of service, including 2 combat deployments and a specialist certification in logistics and supply chain operations that most people would have leveraged into an immediate defense contractor position after discharge. He hadn't done that. He'd taken a warehouse supervisor role at a mid-sized freight company in the city, which paid roughly a third of what a contractor position would have. The record didn't explain why. She thought she could guess. His performance reviews, obtained through the professional channels, showed the same pattern across 3 jobs. Strong operational results, strong team retention, consistent conflict with upper management over resource allocation and staffing decisions. He'd been right more often than the people who'd overruled him. That was the kind of thing that made a certain type of manager uncomfortable and made Victoria Sterling very interested. His employment status showed as terminated, current, which meant he was looking. She thought about calling him directly. She considered it, turned it over, and decided against it. If she called him and told him who she was, the dynamic would be contaminated from the start. He'd wonder whether he was being helped or hired, and either way he'd be operating under an obligation that hadn't existed at the park bench. She needed to know if he could do the job. The job was real, the vacancy was real, and her operations director search had been ongoing for 2 months with no candidate who made her feel like the problem would actually be solved. She called Dana instead. "I need you to reach out to a candidate," she said. "His name is Ethan Walker. He applied for a manager position last week. I want him considered for the director level." Dana was quiet for a moment. "The director role is substantially different from—" "I know what the roles are. Run him through the standard process. Don't mention that you have a referral from me. If he can't do the job, he won't survive the evaluation anyway." Another pause. "And if he asks how his profile came to our attention?" "Talent pipeline," Victoria said. "Which is accurate." Dana said she'd handle it. Victoria thanked her and hung up and sat at her desk for a moment, looking out at the city through her office window, 22 floors up, the morning still gray and cold and beginning to move. She didn't know whether she was making a leadership decision or a personal one. She suspected it was both, and that the only way to find out was to see what happened when Ethan Walker walked into a real evaluation without any safety net under him. The second interview call came from Dana 11 days after the first meeting. "We'd like to bring you in for a deeper evaluation," Dana said. "This would be a full-day session, operations case study, panel interview with department heads, and a final conversation with senior leadership." "Full day," Ethan said. "We take the director level seriously. What time do I need to be there?" He told Marcus that evening, and Marcus made him practice answering questions for 45 minutes, sitting across from each other at Ethan's kitchen table with the overhead light on, and Marcus asking things like, Tell me about a time you failed as a leader and how do you handle an employee who's talented but consistently undermines team culture? And Ethan answering them, and Marcus periodically shaking his head and saying, no, say that again, but like you believe it. You believe it, Marcus said, after the fourth or fifth answer. But you're still talking like you're making a report. Loosen up. You know what you're talking about. It's an interview. It's a conversation, Marcus said. Only difference is the stakes. Lily was in her room during this, ostensibly doing homework. At one point, she came out for a glass of water and stood in the kitchen doorway watching them for a moment. What are you doing? She asked. Practice, Marcus said. For what? For your dad's big interview. She looked at Ethan with an expression that was difficult to read, part cautious, part something else. Then she went back to her room without saying anything. Later, after Marcus left and Lily was in bed, Ethan checked on her and found her still awake, lying on her back looking at the ceiling. Hey, he said from the doorway. Thought you were asleep. Is it a good company? She asked. Seems like it. Is it the kind where you'll have to work all the time? He leaned against the doorframe. I don't know yet. I haven't gotten the job. But if you do... He thought about that honestly, the way she deserved. I try to make sure it didn't work like that. She turned her head to look at him. You always say try. Because trying is the honest part. I'll make sure as a promise I can't always keep. She seemed to consider this. Then she said, okay, and rolled over, pulling the blanket up to her ear, which meant the conversation was done. He stood in the doorway for a moment after her breathing evened out. The apartment was quiet around him, the way it got late at night when the street outside settled and the building stopped making its daytime noises. He stood there with the hallway light behind him and thought about the meeting on Wednesday, about the panel of department heads and the case study he'd need to walk through, and the senior leadership conversation at the end that Dana had mentioned without elaborating. He thought about the woman on the bench, Victoria. He'd thought about her occasionally over the past 2 weeks, not obsessively, just as a passing thing. The way you thought about people you encountered briefly and never expected to see again. He hoped she'd found somewhere warm. He had no way of knowing that the company expecting him in 4 days had her name on every piece of internal paperwork above the title that read Founder and CEO, or that she had read his performance reviews more carefully than anyone in his working life ever had, or that she was, at roughly this same hour, sitting in an office 22 floors above the city, going through third-quarter operational reports and making notes in the margins and thinking, without quite admitting it to herself, that she was more curious about Wednesday than she usually allowed herself to be. He turned off the hallway light. He set his alarm for 6. He went to bed. Wednesday arrived the way important days sometimes did, quietly, without ceremony, the alarm going off at 6 like any other morning, the apartment cold because the building's heat ran low overnight, and Ethan hadn't gotten around to calling the super about it. He lay in bed for exactly 90 seconds, which was a habit from the Navy. You didn't linger, you assessed, and you moved. And then he was up, putting on coffee, checking that Lily's lunch was packed from the night before, running through the day in his head the way he used to run through mission parameters. He'd laid his clothes out the night before. The shirt Marcus had ironed, a charcoal jacket he'd bought 3 years ago for a funeral and worn twice since, dark slacks, the only pair of dress shoes he owned, which he'd polished with a kit he'd found in the back of the closet. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror while he shaved and thought he looked like a version of himself that he didn't entirely recognize. More formal, more assembled. He nicked himself just below the jawline and pressed a square of toilet paper to it and stood there waiting for it to stop, which felt like an appropriate start to the day. Lily came out at 7, still in her pajamas, hair at a complicated angle from sleeping. She looked at him in his jacket and said nothing for a moment. "You look like a news guy," she said finally. "That's reassuring." "I meant it nice." She opened the refrigerator and stood in front of it the way she did every morning, as if the contents might have changed overnight. "We have cereal. There's also a banana." "I know about the banana." She took the cereal down from the shelf and got a bowl without being asked and poured it herself and sat at the table. And he stood at the counter with his coffee and watched her eat and thought about the fact that she'd been dressing herself and packing her own backpack and making her own breakfast with minimal prompting since she was 5, which was useful and also sometimes felt like an indictment of something he couldn't quite name. "Wish me luck," he said when it was time to go. She looked up. You don't need luck. Everyone needs luck. She shook her head, very certain, the way children were certain about things. You need them to see you right. That's different. He didn't know what to do with that, so he picked up his keys. Chug. The building looked the same as it had 2 weeks ago. The lobby, the keycard elevator, the receptionist with the calibrated smile. But this time she led him to a different floor, higher up, and the conference room she brought him to was larger, with a whiteboard along one wall and 6 chairs arranged around the table instead of 2. Water, notepad, the Arcturus pen. He waited. The panel arrived over the course of about 4 minutes, which told him something about internal coordination. Not a criticism, just data. 3 men and 1 woman, ranging from their mid-30s to early 50s. They introduced themselves in sequence. Grant Holloway, VP of Hub Operations. Serena Cho, Director of Technology and Systems. David Parrish, Head of Finance, and Tom Berenger, who ran human resources and had the particular energy of someone who'd been in rooms like this so many times that he'd learned to make his attention look active even when it wasn't. They gave him the case study first, which was standard. A packet of materials representing a fictional regional logistics network with 3 hubs, 6 months of operational data, and a list of problems ranging from obvious to buried. He had 90 minutes. He read through the materials once fast and once slow, the way he'd learned to read briefings, and then he started working. The obvious problems were there to see if you'd do the obvious things, which was not the point. The buried problems were more interesting. A staffing imbalance between Hub 2 and Hub 3 that wasn't showing up in the efficiency metrics because Hub 2 was consistently running overtime to compensate, which meant the overtime costs were being absorbed into the labor line without anyone flagging that the root issue was a routing problem, not a staffing problem. And the routing problem, when you traced it back, came from a software integration that had been only partially completed 8 months ago, which had created a gap in the tracking system that no one had formally documented because the workaround had become standard practice. He wrote it up in longhand on the notepad, organized by priority and by what he'd need to verify on the ground before making any recommendations, because the case study was a representation of a real situation, and representations always had gaps that the actual floor would fill in. When Grant Holloway asked him to walk them through his findings, Ethan stood and used the whiteboard and talked for 22 minutes. He didn't read from the notepad. He'd internalized it. He drew the routing flow and the cost attribution and the staffing distribution, and he explained what he thought was actually happening versus what the reports would suggest was happening. And he said twice that certain conclusions would need to be validated directly with the hub teams before anything structural changed, because you couldn't fix a people problem from a conference room. There was a silence when he finished. Holloway wrote something down. Serena Cho said, "The software gap you identified, most candidates miss that. They focus on the staffing numbers." "The staffing numbers are a symptom," Ethan said. "What if you're wrong? What if the staffing imbalance is the root issue?" "Then I'd know that after talking to the shift leads at Hub 2, he said. "Either way, I don't write a fix until I've been on the floor." Tom Berenger, who had been mostly quiet, leaned forward. "How do you handle it when you're on the floor and what you find contradicts what leadership has already decided?" "Depends on what leadership decided and why," Ethan said. "Assume they decided it for financial reasons. Cutting costs. The math works on paper, but the floor tells you a different story." Ethan looked at him. "I'd bring the floor's story back to leadership, documented, and make the case for why the math changes when you account for what the spreadsheet isn't capturing. Turnover costs, error rates, overtime bleed. The floor always tells you things the spreadsheet doesn't. And if leadership doesn't want to hear it, then I've done my job. The decision is theirs, but they make it with accurate information." Berenger sat back, made a note. The panel interview ran another 40 minutes, covering team conflict, budget management, and a hypothetical about having to reduce operational output at one hub to stabilize another when both were under-resourced. He answered everything as directly as he could, without performing certainty he didn't have, and when he didn't know something he said so and explained what he'd do to find out. When it was over, Dana came to collect him and walked him to a smaller room down the hall, a waiting area with a sofa and a side table with a coffee maker, and told him senior leadership would be with him shortly. He sat down. He poured himself coffee. He looked out the window at the city, which was gray and bright at the same time the way it got on overcast days in early spring. And he thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill he'd learned in the military and used more often than he'd expected in civilian life. He heard the door handle. He stood up. She came in without an assistant, without a folder, without the particular advanced staging that executives sometimes use to manage how they entered a room. She was wearing a dark blazer over a gray shirt, her hair pulled back, and she looked professional, composed. The kind of composed that was not effortless but had been practiced long enough that the effort was no longer visible. She also looked exactly like the woman who had been sitting on a park bench in Calder Park 3 weeks ago, holding a cup of coffee he'd bought her with his last $27. Ethan didn't move for a second. He was good at not letting things show on his face. The Navy had helped with that. And before the Navy, his life had helped with that. But something must have crossed it anyway, because she was watching him, and she saw it, and she didn't look away from it. She held his gaze steady, which told him she'd been waiting for this moment, had prepared for it, and wasn't going to pretend it wasn't happening. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I'm Victoria Sterling. I'm the CEO of Arcturus Logistics." The room was very quiet. He said, "I know who you are." A beat. "You recognized me." "Yes." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, and after a moment he sat too because standing felt theatrical, and he wasn't interested in theater right now. He was interested in understanding what he was actually sitting in the middle of. "When did you figure it out?" she asked. "Just now, seeing you." She nodded, as if that was the answer she'd expected. "Not before? You didn't look up the company when you got the call?" "I looked up the company. I didn't look up who ran it." He paused. "I wasn't looking for you." That landed in the room between them and sat there. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "You don't owe me anything," he said, "but I'd like one." She told him, then, the experiment, the 14 hours, the bus stop, and the subway and the mall. She was precise about it and didn't dress it up as noble or philosophical. She described it the way she might describe a market research initiative, because that was partly what it had been. She told him about the security guard and the woman who crossed the street and the long hours in which no one had done what he did. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "So, this interview is a real interview," she said immediately. "The position is real. The evaluation you just went through is the same one every candidate goes through. Whatever Dana and the panel told me about your performance today, I didn't influence and I won't influence." "But you put me in the pipeline." "I flagged you to Dana. I told her to run you through the standard process and see if you could do the job." "Because of the park." "Because of what I saw in the park," she said, with a distinction in her voice that she clearly wanted him to catch. "There's a difference between being grateful someone bought you a sandwich and thinking that person has the qualities you need in a director-level role. I've been looking for someone for this position for 2 months. The panel doesn't know about the park. They evaluated you on your work today." He looked at her for a long moment. She met it without flinching, which he noticed. "What if I'd been terrible?" he asked. "At the evaluation? Then you wouldn't be in this room. You'd have just let it go." "Yes." He sat back slightly. He believed her, which was a strange thing to realize, but he did. She had the quality, rare and hard to fake, of someone who meant what they said in proportion to how directly they said it. She hadn't dressed up the explanation or softened the edges of what she'd done. She'd laid it out and let him respond to it honestly, which was itself a form of respect. "What did the panel say?" he asked. "That you identified the routing gap," she said. "Grant Holloway has been trying to get someone to name that problem clearly for 3 months, and that you said twice you'd need to validate your findings on the floor before recommending anything structural." She paused. "The last director we had in that role never once walked a floor he didn't schedule in advance." "That's how you get shown what people want you to see." "Exactly." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that happened when 2 people were being careful about what they said next because what they said next mattered. "I need to ask you something," Ethan said. "Go ahead." "Is this a situation where I'll be expected to perform some kind of gratitude for the opportunity? Because I won't do that. I'll do the job and do it well, but I'm not capable of pretending I owe someone something I don't owe them." She looked at him steadily. If I wanted gratitude, I wouldn't have run you through a 6-hour evaluation. He nodded. Once. Okay. There are more stages, she said. This isn't an offer. The board has to sign off on a hire at this level, and they're not going to make it easy. There are people on the board who already have a candidate they prefer for this role. Who? Someone whose father sits on 2 of our partner companies' advisory boards. She said it without visible emotion, which told him she had plenty of emotion about it that she'd already worked through. His operational experience is thinner than yours. His network is considerably thicker. But you're the CEO. I am. And the board has leverage they're not shy about using when they disagree with hiring decisions at the director level. She folded her hands on the table. I'm telling you this because I don't want you to go through additional rounds and then be blindsided if the politics make the outcome more complicated than your qualifications deserve. He considered that. Are you warning me off? He asked. I'm giving you accurate information and letting you decide. He thought about Lily, asking whether it was a good company. He thought about the termination letter folded in thirds in his jacket pocket, which he'd stopped carrying with him after the first week, but which he could still feel the weight of if he thought about it. What are the additional rounds? He said. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. Not relief exactly, closer to the thing that happened when a calculation confirmed itself. One more panel, she said, and a site visit to the Delaney hub, which is the most problematic of the 3. I want to see how you read a live operation. When? Friday, for the panel. The site visit we'd schedule for next week if Friday goes well. He nodded. She stood, and he stood, and she put out her hand, and he shook it, and the handshake was businesslike and brief, and then she said, For what it's worth. What you did in the park. That wasn't nothing. He looked at her. Neither was the coffee, he said. It came out slightly drier than he intended, and she blinked once and then laughed. A short, real laugh, not performed, the kind that escaped rather than being produced. And for a second she looked substantially less like a CEO and more like the woman on the bench who'd said, You don't have to do that, and meant it. No, she said. It wasn't, quote. He sat in his truck for 10 minutes before driving anywhere. He tried to organize what had just happened into something he could process linearly, which was how he dealt with things that contained too many variables at once. The interview had gone well. That much seemed clear from the panel's responses and from the fact that he was talking to the CEO at all. The job was real. The evaluation was real. Those were solid facts. The other facts were less solid. Victoria Sterling had engineered his entry into the process, which was different from engineering the outcome, but it still meant his presence here wasn't entirely organic. That bothered him, not in the way that made him want to walk away from it. The opportunity was real regardless of the path, but in the way that introduced a variable he couldn't fully account for. He didn't like variables he couldn't account for. He also couldn't stop thinking about the board, the candidate with the advisory board connections. He'd been in enough organizations to understand what that meant practically. It meant someone was already counting the votes, and the votes had been partially counted before the interviews even started. He started the truck. He needed to pick Lily up at 3:15. He called Marcus from the road. How'd it go? Marcus answered without preamble. Complicated, Ethan said. Complicated good or complicated bad? Both. He stopped at a light. The CEO was the woman from the park, the one Lily and I found. The silence on Marcus's end was long enough to be meaningful. The homeless woman. She wasn't homeless. She was conducting some kind of social experiment to see how people treated strangers. Another pause. And you stopped. We stopped. Marcus made the sound he made when he was thinking something through. So she gave you the job. She put me in the process. The evaluation was real, same thing everyone goes through. She didn't know how I'd do. But she put you in. Yeah. Ethan. Marcus's voice was steady. If every person she observed that day had stopped to help her, and you were the only one who happened to also be good at logistics operations, would you still be bothered by this? He thought about it. The light changed. No, he said. Then what's the actual problem? There's a board candidate they may prefer regardless of qualifications. Oh, a beat. That's a different problem. Yeah, that problem you can't fix from the truck. I know. Go get your daughter, Marcus said. Figure out the rest later. Yeah. Lily was waiting on the after-school steps when he pulled up, sitting with two other girls, her backpack between her feet. She saw the truck and said something to the girls and picked up her bag and came down the steps and got in. She looked at him. Well? She said. Well, what? Dad. He pulled away from the curb. It went okay. Okay, or okay like you don't want to say something. He drove half a block before he said, the CEO of the company, Victoria. She was the woman from the park. Lily turned in her seat. The bench lady. Yeah. The one we got food for? Yes. Lily processed this. She looked out the windshield. She turned it over the way she did with things that required more than a reflexive response, and he waited because she was going to say something worth hearing. Is she nice? Lily asked. Like actually nice, not just work nice. I think so. Do you think she'll give you the job? I don't know. There are more steps. Lily nodded seriously, as if she was adding this to an internal case file. Then she said, but she remembered you. What? She remembered you from the park. She could have just not done anything, but she did something. Lily shrugged, settling back into her seat. That means she's actually nice. Ethan looked at the road. Maybe, he said. Not maybe, Lily said. She remembered. He passed the Friday panel. He knew it in the room, the way you sometimes knew things before they were confirmed. Not from confidence, but from the specific texture of the conversation. The way Holloway had stopped hedging his language in the last 20 minutes. The way Serena Cho had started asking forward-looking questions rather than evaluative ones, moving from how have you handled to how would you approach, which was a different mode entirely. David Parrish, the head of finance, had been the hardest. He spent 40 minutes with Ethan going through the budget implications of his proposed fix for the Hub 2 routing problem, and he was precise and difficult and unwilling to accept anything approximate, which Ethan respected. He pushed back 3 times on Ethan's overtime cost projections, and twice Ethan revised his numbers when the pushback was valid, and once he held his ground and explained why, and Parrish made a note and moved on. After the panel, Dana told him the site visit was confirmed for Tuesday. He drove home and let himself into the apartment and stood in the middle of the living room for a moment in the quiet of the empty afternoon. Lily still at school, the building still, and thought that he was closer to this than he'd been to anything in a long time, and that closeness was its own kind of weight. The Delaney Hub was 40 minutes outside the city, a large distribution facility adjacent to a rail corridor, the kind of building that was more functional than it looked from the outside and more complicated than its function suggested. Victoria met him in the parking lot, which surprised him. He'd expected her to be inside to have someone escort him in. Instead, she was standing by the entrance in a hard hat with the Arcturus logo, holding a second one, and she handed it to him without comment. I don't usually do these in a blazer, he said, looking at her jacket. I don't usually do these at all, she said. The last CEO to visit this hub was my predecessor, and he lasted 4 hours before going back to headquarters. What happened in 4 hours? Nothing. That was the problem. He saw nothing wrong, filed a positive report, and the hub continued to operate at 62% efficiency. She pushed open the door. Come on. The facility was loud in the specific way that large operations were loud. Not chaos, but the accumulated noise of many systems running simultaneously. Conveyor systems, forklifts, the sound of pallets being moved, voices calling across the floor in the shorthand that workers developed when they'd been working the same space together for long enough. He felt something settle in him when he walked in. This was a language he understood. He spent 3 hours on the floor. He talked to shift leads, 4 of them, without Victoria in earshot, because people talked differently when management was listening, and he needed what they actually thought. He asked about equipment, a conveyor section on the east end that had been running with a temporary repair for, according to one shift lead named Carl, 6 months. He asked about staffing patterns and learned that Tuesday and Wednesday mid-shifts were consistently undermanned because the scheduling system drew from a central pool that didn't account for hub-specific volume patterns. He found the software integration gap he'd identified in the case study, But in person, it was more concrete. A physical gap between two scanning systems that required a human workaround that took approximately 40 seconds per package on the affected line, which added up across a full shift to a number that explained the efficiency reports in a way the spreadsheets hadn't. He found Victoria in the operations office on the mezzanine level, where she'd been doing something with her laptop, and he laid it out for her. The equipment, the staffing pattern, the scanning gap, and a preliminary sense of what it would take to address each one in order of urgency. She listened with her arms crossed, not defensive, more like how she concentrated. "How long to stabilize?" she asked when he finished. 90 days to address the critical issues. Maybe 120 before you'd see it in the efficiency numbers. The board is going to want to see results faster than that. The board is going to see what the operation can actually produce, he said. If someone promises them faster, they're being lied to. She looked at him. "You know that's not what boards want to hear." "I know," he said, "but it's what I'd tell them." She uncrossed her arms. She turned and looked out the mezzanine window at the floor below them. The lines moving, the workers moving, the accumulated noise and motion of an operation that was struggling but still running. "The board meets in 12 days, she said. "There's a restructuring proposal on the table. It includes eliminating positions at this hub and consolidating operations at the central facility, which on paper reduces costs by 14%. And off paper? Off paper, it disperses the experienced workforce, adds transit time to the eastern distribution zone, and overloads the central hub's existing infrastructure." She paused. "The board sees the 14%. What do they not see? The cost of rebuilding institutional knowledge when the people who have it leave. The error rates during transition. The customer attrition if delivery times increase in the east." She turned back from the window. "And they don't see what I see when I'm standing on this floor, which is 430 people who come to work every day and do a job that is harder than it looks." He stood beside her and looked at the floor below. "Is that what the last 2 months of interviews have been about?" he said. "Finding someone who can make the case against the restructuring?" She thought about that honestly. "Partly. And partly finding someone who can make the operation good enough that the case doesn't need to be made, because the numbers speak." 90 days, he said. "Maybe less for some of it. If you get the job." "If I get the job." She nodded, looking at the floor. 430 people. The conveyors running. Carl and his temporary repair that had been temporary for 6 months. "There's still the board vote on the candidate," she said. "I know. It's not a sure thing." I know that too." She turned to face him. There was something in her expression that was difficult to categorize. Not doubt, not certainty, something in between that looked like the particular tension of someone who had made as many decisions as she could make and was now waiting on something she couldn't control. "You handled today well," she said. "Carl handled today well," Ethan said. "He's been running that east line with a patched conveyor for 6 months and hitting 70% efficiency anyway. That's not a failure of the operation. That's the operation outperforming its conditions." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm going to the board in 12 days, she said. "I'll tell you what happens." He put the hard hat back on the hook by the door. Outside, the parking lot was cold and gray, the rail corridor beyond the fence sitting still in the mid-afternoon quiet. He got into his truck and drove back toward the city, and somewhere around mile 20 he let himself think. Carefully, deliberately, the way he'd learned to think about things he wanted and wasn't sure he'd get, that he wanted this job. Not because of the money, though the money mattered. Not because of the title, because there were 430 people in that building and a CEO who was trying to protect them from a board that saw a 14% line item and not the faces underneath it. And he knew how to help with that, and he hadn't known how to help with anything in a long time. He picked Lily up at 3:15. "How was the thing?" she asked, climbing in. "Good," he said. "I think it was good." She looked at him with the careful assessment she'd developed over 7 years of reading him. "Your jaw is loose," she said. "What?" "The tight thing. It's not doing it." She buckled her seatbelt. "That means you actually think it went good." He pulled out of the parking lot. "Yeah," he said. "I actually think it did." The 12 days felt longer than they were. Ethan had learned, over the course of his adult life, that waiting was its own kind of discipline, that the ability to sit with uncertainty without letting it corrode your functioning was a skill as real as any technical competency, and one that most people underestimated until they needed it. He'd waited in worse situations. He'd waited in positions where the outcome wasn't just a job, but whether someone came home. He knew how to wait. That didn't mean it was comfortable. He kept his routine because routine was the architecture that held things upright when everything else was provisional. Up at 6. Coffee. Lily's lunch. Job applications in the morning. He hadn't stopped sending them because stopping felt like betting on an outcome he didn't control, and he didn't make bets he couldn't afford. Pickup at 3:15. Dinner. Evenings that were quieter than they used to be, before the warehouse, before the termination letter, back when tired had a different quality to it. The tired of a man who had too much to do, rather than the tired of a man who was waiting to find out if he'd have enough. He didn't hear from Victoria directly. He hadn't expected to. She'd said she'd tell him after the board meeting, and the board meeting was in 12 days, and until then he existed in the precise middle distance between a process that had gone well and an outcome that was not guaranteed, which was a specific kind of limbo he'd been in before and had never learned to enjoy. Marcus came over on the 5th day, and they watched a basketball game neither of them particularly cared about. And Marcus brought beer and pretzels and asked no questions about the job, which was the most useful thing he could have done. Lily appeared from her room during the 3rd quarter and sat between them and declared that basketball was boring, and then watched the rest of the game with complete attention. "She's going to say it wasn't boring when it ends," Marcus said quietly. "I heard that," Lily said. "You weren't supposed to." "Basketball is still boring," she said, "but I want to see who wins." That was the best evening of those 12 days. What and Sam. On the morning of this board meeting, Ethan drove Lily to school himself instead of letting her take the bus. It wasn't something he'd planned. He was already in his jacket, already had his keys, and she was coming down the hall with her backpack, and he just said, "I'll take you." And she looked at him and didn't ask why and said, "Okay." The school was 12 minutes away. They drove without the radio on, which was unusual. Lily almost always reached for the dial and found something she liked, some pop song she half knew the words to and sang along badly. This morning she didn't. She sat with her backpack on her lap and watched the streets go by. 3 blocks from school she said, "Today's the day, right? The board thing." "Yeah." "What time?" "I don't know exactly. Sometime this morning." She nodded. She looked out the window. Then she said, "What happens if they pick the other guy?" He thought about how to answer that. He could have said, "We'll be fine," which was what he would have said 3 weeks ago. But she'd been right about the eggs, and she was right about his jaw, and she deserved something more than a reflex. "Then I keep looking," he said. "We've still got options." "But you want this one." He pulled up to the school drop-off lane and put the truck in park. "Yeah," he said, "I want this one." She unbuckled her seatbelt and picked up her backpack and opened the door. Then she stopped and turned back, 1 foot out. "You helped her when you didn't have to," she said. And she remembered. "I think that counts for something." She climbed out and shut the door and walked up the school steps. And he sat in the drop-off lane until the car behind him tapped its horn lightly, and then he pulled out and drove. And he thought about what she'd said the whole way home. "I think that counts for something." And couldn't decide if she was talking about Victoria or about something else entirely. The Arcturus Board of Directors met in the executive conference suite on the 22nd floor, which was a room Ethan had never been in and would not be in today. 12 members, 7 of whom Victoria needed to hold in order to push through a hiring decision that 2 members were actively working to redirect. He knew this because she'd told him at the end of the site visit, with the matter-of-fact candor that he'd come to recognize as her baseline mode of operating. She didn't soften the political reality. She laid it out and let people work with accurate information, which was, he thought, the same standard she'd asked of him when she described the Delaney Hub. What he didn't know, sitting in his apartment that morning refreshing his email with a discipline he was not proud of, was how the room actually moved. It started at 9. Richard Holt, the board member who'd been championing the alternative candidate, a man named Preston Ware, whose father was on the advisory boards of 2 Arcturus partner companies, had arrived early and spent 20 minutes before the meeting started working the room in the specific way that people who were very good at institutional politics worked rooms. Unhurried, conversational, leaving each person with the impression that he'd sought them out individually rather than working a list. He was 62, silver-haired, and had been on the Arcturus board since the company's second year of operation, which gave him the particular authority of someone who could locate himself in the company's history. He didn't dislike Victoria. He would have said, if asked, that he respected her. What he believed, with the settled conviction of someone who had been making this kind of decision for decades, was that companies at Arcturus's stage of growth needed leadership infrastructure that was connected, that knew the right people, moved in the right rooms, could bring external relationships to bear on the problems that operations alone couldn't solve. Preston Ware brought that. His operational experience was thinner, yes, but experience could be developed. Networks couldn't be manufactured after the fact. This was not an unreasonable position. It was, in fact, a position that had merit in certain contexts and in certain phases of a company's development, and Holt had made it calmly and clearly in 3 separate pre-meeting conversations and would make it again in the room. Victoria sat at the head of the table and let him make it. She'd prepared differently than Holt. She wasn't a room worker. She'd tried it early in her career and found it felt dishonest in a way she couldn't shake, like she was auditioning a version of herself that wasn't accurate. Instead, she'd prepared a presentation, which she now moved through without rushing, covering the operational state of the 3 regional hubs in terms that were specific and unglamorous, where the efficiency numbers actually stood, what was driving the gaps, and what a director with the right capabilities could realistically accomplish in a 90 to 120-day window. Then she talked about the restructuring proposal. She put the 14% cost reduction on the screen and left it there, and then she put beside it a second column she called unmodeled costs, which included her projection for workforce attrition during transition, error rate increases during the knowledge transfer gap, and estimated customer attrition in the Eastern Distribution Zone based on the delivery time increase the consolidation would produce. When she added the unmodeled column to the equation, the net benefit of the restructuring dropped to under 4%. These are projections, said James Whitfield, a board member who ran his own consulting firm. The 14% is real. The second column is speculative. The second column is based on documented outcomes from 3 similar consolidations in the industry in the last 6 years, Victoria said. I can share the source data. The industry comparisons aren't exact. They're not, but they're the closest thing to a precedent we have. And in all 3 cases, the projected savings were significantly eroded by transition costs that were categorized as unmodeled at the planning stage. Whitfield wrote something down. He wasn't opposed to her. He was doing his job, which was to stress test the argument, and she was doing hers, which was to hold up under it. Holt, when he spoke, was measured. No one is arguing against operational improvement, Victoria. The question is whether the best path to that improvement is a director hire at this level, or whether a restructuring that rationalizes the cost base first gives us a stronger foundation to build from. The foundation is the people, Victoria said. If we eliminate 430 experienced positions and rebuild from a smaller central hub, we're not starting from a stronger foundation. We're starting from scratch and calling it efficiency. That's one interpretation. It's the interpretation that accounts for what consolidations actually cost, not just what they save on paper. The room was quiet for a moment in the particular way rooms got quiet when the substantive part of an argument had been made, and what remained was the counting. Holt tried one more line, which was the one Ethan would never hear directly, but which Marcus would summarize for him 2 days later when Victoria mentioned it in passing. The candidate you're proposing has no executive experience at this level. He's managed warehouse teams. We're talking about a regional director role that interfaces with the board, with major clients, with partner organizations. That requires a different kind of profile. Victoria looked at him. He managed teams under conditions that don't have a corporate equivalent, she said. He identified an operational problem in a case study that your VP of Hub Operations has been trying to articulate clearly for 3 months. He spent 3 hours on the Delaney floor and came back with a more accurate diagnostic than anything we've generated internally in the last 6 months. She paused. And when I told him the board might prefer a different candidate, he didn't ask me to advocate for him. He asked what the next step was. Holt leaned back. He was not a man who lost arguments visibly. He absorbed them and recalibrated. You feel strongly about this. I feel accurate about it, she said. Strong feelings are harder to defend. The vote, when it came, was 8-4 votes. Ethan's phone rang at 11:47. He was at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a cup of coffee that had gone cold and an application he'd been staring at for 20 minutes without filling in the next field. He looked at the screen, Victoria Sterling, and something went still in him, the way things went still when the moment you'd been waiting for arrived, and there was no longer any point in preparing for it. He answered. "The board voted this morning," she said without preamble. 8-4 in favor. The position is yours if you want it. He sat back in his chair. The kitchen was quiet. Through the window, he could see the top of the oak tree at the edge of the parking lot, the new leaves just coming in, small and pale green. "Ethan," she said. "I'm here," he said. "Yes, I want it." "Good." There was something in her voice that was not quite relief, more like the release of a tension that had been held at a specific pitch for a while. "Dana will send you the formal offer this afternoon. Start date is 2 weeks from Monday, which gives you time to handle logistics. There's an orientation structure, and I'd like to sit down with you before you start to go over the Delaney priorities and the board context so you're not walking in blind." "I appreciate that." "You'll need a suit," she said, and he could hear that she almost didn't say it, that it was a practical thing she'd been holding and had decided to say directly rather than let him figure out on his own. "I know," he said. "The offer is senior level. The compensation will handle it." "Okay." A pause, shorter than comfortable but not awkward. "You earned it," she said. "I want to be clear about that. The board didn't do you a favor, and neither did I. You walked through the same evaluation as everyone else, and you did it better." He looked at the oak tree, the pale green leaves. "Tell that to the 4 who voted against," he said. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "They'll come around. 4 months from now, when Delaney's efficiency numbers move, they'll have decided they were in favor all along." "That's how it works?" "That's always how it works." He sat with the phone after she hung up. He didn't do anything for about 2 minutes, just sat. Then he called Marcus, who picked up on the second ring and said nothing when Ethan told him, just made a long, slow exhale that communicated several things at once. 8-4, Ethan said. 8 is enough, Marcus said. "Yeah." "You going to pick up Lily and tell her?" "At 3:15. "What are you going to do until 3:15? Ethan looked around the apartment. The yellow legal pad on the table with the 30-day problem list he'd written out the morning after losing the warehouse job, most of it now addressed or no longer relevant. The refrigerator that had actual food in it. The jar of pasta sauce that wasn't nearly empty anymore. "I think I'm going to clean," he said. Marcus laughed. A real one. Unguarded. "Yeah," he said. "Okay, go clean." The offer letter came at 2:18. He read it 3 times, not because he didn't understand it, but because reading it 3 times made it more real, gave it the texture of something that was actually happening, rather than something he was waiting to be told wasn't. The salary was more than he'd made in any previous job. Not extravagantly. It was competitive for the level, which he'd researched, but it was enough that certain calculations he'd been running for months could stop. The truck payment, the after-school program, the grocery math. He could stop doing the grocery math, which was something he hadn't fully realized he was doing constantly until he sat there with the offer letter and felt it stop. He picked Lily up at 3:15. She came down the steps and looked at his face and stopped on the second step. "You got it," she said. "Yeah." She came down the last step and stood in front of him and then put her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his jacket and didn't say anything. He put his hand on the back of her head. She smelled like school, pencil shavings, and the faintly industrial scent of institutional soap, and she held on for longer than she usually did. "Okay," she said, pulling back. "Okay." "Okay," he agreed. She climbed into the truck and buckled her seatbelt and said, "Can we get pizza?" "Yeah," he said. "We can get pizza." "Carmine's?" "Carmine's." She turned on the radio, found something she half knew the words to and sang along badly, and didn't stop when he glanced at her, and he drove them to Carmine's, and they took the corner booth, and Paul brought the ginger ale without being asked, and Lily ordered cheese and mushroom, and this time Ethan ordered the pasta because he could, and they ate, and she got sauce on her sleeve, and he didn't say anything about the napkin. The 2 weeks before his start date moved faster than the 12 days of waiting had. He bought 2 suits. He'd intended to buy one, but Dana had mentioned in the onboarding materials that the director role involved client visits and quarterly presentations, and one suit for those occasions was going to wear thin fast. So he bought 2, both charcoal, different cuts. He also bought 4 shirts that didn't require Marcus's iron intervention, and a pair of shoes that cost more than anything he'd bought for himself in 3 years, and which he wore around the apartment for 2 evenings in a row to break in before the first day. Lily inspected the suits when he brought them home, walking around him slowly while he stood in the living room feeling slightly absurd. "You look like a different person," she said. "Bad different or good different?" She thought about it. "Still you, but like the serious version." "I'm always serious." "You know what I mean." She tugged the jacket lapel slightly. "You look like someone who's in charge." "I'm going to be in charge." "I know." She stepped back. "Just making sure you look like it." He started on a Monday. The Arcturus headquarters building, the lobby, the elevator, all of it familiar now from the interview process, but different in the way that places were different when you were arriving as someone who worked there, rather than someone who was being evaluated. His office was on the 19th floor, which was not the executive floor, that was 22, but it had a window and a desk that was larger than any desk he'd had before, and a computer that was considerably faster than his laptop at home, and a view of the city that on clear days went all the way to the river. He spent the first day in orientation and the second in back-to-back meetings with Holloway, Cho, and Parrish, who were all, in their different ways, professional about the hire. Holloway genuinely so, Cho with the brisk collegiality of someone who cared about results more than personnel decisions, Parrish with the careful neutrality of someone who didn't let his opinions show until he had data. On the third day he went to Delaney. He didn't announce it. He called Carl the shift lead the night before and said he was coming and asked Carl to please not rearrange anything. "I want to see it the way it runs, not the way it runs when someone important is visiting." And Carl said he appreciated that, and that the East conveyor had taken another hit that weekend and the temporary repair was now a temporary repair on top of a temporary repair. He drove out at 5:30 in the morning to catch the opening of the early shift, and he arrived before the sun was fully up and walked the floor in the gray pre-dawn light of the facility's overhead fluorescence. And he worked alongside the team for 4 hours before he sat down with Carl and 2 other shift leads and a whiteboard and started mapping what needed to happen and in what order. The conveyor part was ordered by noon. Ethan paid for expedited shipping out of discretionary budget without filing a committee request, which he technically had the authority to do, and which he did because the alternative was a week-long approval process, while Carl's team continued to patch something that needed to be fixed. He got a call from Parrish at 3. "The conveyor part," Parrish said. "You pulled it from discretionary." "I did. I have the authority threshold. It was under the cap." "It was under the cap," Parrish agreed. "I'm not questioning the purchase. I'm noting it because the previous director used that budget line 3 times in 8 months, all 3 times for non-urgent items that had been escalating to avoid committee review." "This was urgent," Ethan said. "The repair was 2 layers deep and compromising output on the East Line. I documented it." "I saw the documentation," Parrish said. "That's why I'm calling to note it, not to challenge it." A beat. "You're telling me you're watching the line," Ethan said. "I'm telling you I'm watching the line," Parrish confirmed. "And so far what I'm seeing looks different from what I was watching before." He hung up, and Ethan sat with that for a moment. It was not warmth exactly. Parrish wasn't a warm man in the conventional sense, but it was something. An acknowledgement of accountability running in both directions, which was what functional oversight looked like. His working relationship with Victoria settled into a shape over the first 3 weeks that surprised him slightly in its directness. She didn't manage him. She established the strategic frame and let him operate within it, checking in twice a week in meetings that ran no longer than they needed to and covered the things that actually required her input. She didn't second-guess decisions he'd made and documented. She pushed back when she disagreed and said so plainly and engaged with his counterarguments without treating pushback as a challenge to her authority. He'd worked for people like that before, but not many, and not at this level. She told him, in the 4th week, about the restructuring proposal and where it stood. The vote hadn't killed it. Holt and 2 other board members had tabled it rather than abandoned it, which meant it was resting on the table like something that would get picked up again if the operational improvement numbers didn't materialize. 90 days, she said. That's what I told them. That's the window. Delaney's moving already, he said. The conveyor fix alone will add 3 to 4 efficiency points once we get the part installed and the line recalibrated. Carl's team has been compensating for that gap for months. Holt knows that. He's not going to give up the restructuring proposal on the basis of one line fix. No, but if Delaney is at 72% efficiency in 60 days instead of 90, it changes the conversation. She looked at him across the conference table. Can you do 60? On Delaney specifically, maybe. The other two hubs have different problems and longer timelines. What if I told the board 60 on Delaney and laid out the full picture on the other two? I'd say make sure the full picture includes why the other two take longer, not as an excuse, as a documented operational reality. Holt will try to use the variation to argue inconsistency. You want the variation to read as nuance, not failure. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her notes. You think like a briefer, she said. I was one. I know. She uncapped her pen and wrote something down. I want you in the room for the next board presentation. Not presenting, observing. I want you to see how they move, what they respond to, where the resistance actually lives versus where it says it lives. He thought about that. Holt? And Whitfield sometimes. Whitfield's not opposed to the direction, but he's cautious about the timeline. And caution can look a lot like opposition when votes are being counted. What would move Whitfield? Data he can interrogate himself, she said, without hesitation. He doesn't trust conclusions someone else has drawn. He wants the raw numbers and room to run his own analysis. Then give him the raw numbers, not a presentation, a data package he can take away and work through. She stopped writing. She looked at him. That's what my last director would have called giving up control of the narrative, she said. Your last director was managing the board's perception. You want to change their conclusions. Those are different projects. She set the pen down. Yes, she said. They are, Shad. The conveyor part arrived on a Thursday, and the installation happened over the weekend. Ethan was at Delaney on Saturday morning in jeans and a flannel shirt, which raised an eyebrow from the maintenance supervisor until Carl told him who Ethan was. And even then the supervisor, a compact, skeptical man named Reuben, who'd been maintaining logistics equipment for 20 years, watched him for about 45 minutes before deciding he could be talked to. The recalibration after installation, Ethan said, watching Reuben's crew work. How long does it typically run? 4 hours if nothing fights us, Reuben said. 6 if it does. What usually makes it fight? Integration with the scanning system on that line. If the speed settings don't talk to the scanner timing correctly, you get misreads. He glanced sideways at Ethan. Which loops back to your software problem. I know about the software problem. You fixing that too? Working on it. It's a longer timeline. Reuben made a non-committal sound. Then, the last director. He came out here once, spent 2 hours in the office looking at reports and left. I heard, Ethan said. You've been out here twice in 3 weeks. Once in a suit and once in that. He gestured vaguely at Ethan's flannel. The suit days are for understanding the scope, Ethan said. The flannel days are for understanding what's actually happening. Reuben didn't respond to that immediately. He watched his crew work for a moment, and then he said, the scanner integration. If you get someone who can fix the gap rather than working around it, I've got a guy on my team who knows that system better than whoever installed it. He wrote the workaround. What's his name? Patterson. Derek Patterson. Can I talk to him Monday? Reuben looked at him again with the assessment that men who'd spent 20 years doing physical work gave to men who hadn't. Yeah, he said. You can talk to him. The installation finished at 4 in the afternoon. The calibration ran clean, 3 hours and 40 minutes, nothing fighting them. And when they ran the first full test sequence on the East Line, the packages moved through without the 40-second manual intervention gap. And Ethan stood on the floor with Reuben and Carl and watched it happen and didn't say anything, just watched, because sometimes the thing that needed saying didn't need to be said. Carl clapped him on the shoulder once, which was its own kind of language. Digdasis at boca. The board presentation was on a Tuesday in the 6th week of Ethan's employment. He sat in the back of the executive conference suite in a chair along the wall, not at the table, which put him in the observer position Victoria had described. He wore one of the charcoal suits, the better-fitting one, and he brought a notepad. Victoria presented for 40 minutes. She was different in this room than she was in the conference room with Ethan. More controlled, her cadence more deliberate, every sentence load-bearing in a way that conversations didn't require. She put the Delaney numbers up at the 20-minute mark. 68% efficiency, up from 62 in 6 weeks, trending towards 73 within the month. Holt made a note. Whitfield asked for the underlying data set. "I'll have it to you this afternoon," Victoria said. "The full operational package, not the summary." Whitfield looked slightly surprised, as if he'd expected to have to argue for it. Holt said, 6 points in 6 weeks is encouraging. It's also 6 points from a baseline of 62, which was already below acceptable operational performance. "It is," Victoria said, "and the trajectory suggests we'll be above 75 by week 12, which is within the range we'd expect from a hub operating without the equipment and software constraints that have been limiting Delaney for the past 18 months. The restructuring proposal, Holt said, would have addressed those constraints through consolidation. The restructuring proposal would have eliminated the workforce that's producing the improvement, Victoria said. Carl Jennings's shift team at Delaney has been operating that hub at 62%, despite a faulty conveyor and a software integration gap, not because of those conditions. You fix the conditions, you don't replace the people. And the numbers show what happens. Ethan watched the room. He watched Whitfield writing, not taking notes, actually working something out, which was what Victoria had predicted. He watched 2 other board members he hadn't met exchange a look that was not hostile and not convinced, but was something in between, which was called persuadable. He watched Holt's jaw, not tight, controlled, which meant he was recalculating rather than dismissing. The restructuring proposal wasn't killed that morning, but it was not picked up from the table either. It stayed where it had been left, and the meeting moved on, and afterward Victoria walked past Ethan on her way out and said, without stopping, "Whitfield is going to call you directly this week. He'll want to ask about the data package. Should I be ready for that?" "I think you'll be fine," she said, and kept walking. He sat for a moment in the emptied conference room. The city was visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, gray-bright in the morning light. Somewhere down in it, 40 minutes by highway, Carl Jennings' team was running packages through an East Line conveyor that now worked the way it was supposed to work, and Derek Patterson was, or would soon be, talking to someone about a software gap that had been generating a 40-second workaround for the better part of a year. Ethan picked up his notepad. He had a 2 o'clock with the Hub 3-shift coordinator and a 4 o'clock with Serena Cho about the scanner integration timeline. And Lily had an after-school event on Thursday that he'd already put in his calendar so he wouldn't schedule anything that ran late. He was not on top of everything. He was aware of at least 3 problems he hadn't yet had time to fully diagnose, and 1 personnel situation at Hub 1 that was going to require a difficult conversation he'd been doing the mental work of preparing for. The board still had a tabled restructuring proposal. Holt was still Holt, but the numbers were moving, and the people on the floor knew someone was paying attention, and Lily's shoes were still lighting up pink on the way to school, and the grocery math had stopped. For right now, that was enough to work with. He took the elevator down to the 19th floor and went back to work. The restructuring proposal died on a Wednesday morning in early April, 11 weeks after Ethan Walker had walked into a full-day evaluation in a borrowed tie and a shirt that Marcus had ironed for him. It didn't die dramatically. There was no single vote, no confrontation, no moment that anyone would later point to as the turning point. It dissolved the way bad proposals sometimes did when the data simply stopped supporting them, incrementally, then all at once. Whitfield had spent 2 weeks working through the operational package Victoria sent him, and he'd come back with 7 specific questions, all of them precise and none of them hostile. And Ethan had answered them in a written memo that Whitfield then apparently forwarded to 2 other board members without comment, which was Whitfield's version of an endorsement. By the time the April meeting arrived, Holt had shifted his language from "the restructuring should proceed" to "the restructuring remains an option. We should retain for future consideration," which was the linguistic equivalent of putting something in a drawer and losing the key. Delaney was running at 77% efficiency. Carl had sent Ethan a text the morning the number was confirmed. Just the number, 77%. No context, no explanation. And Ethan had read it at his kitchen counter at 6:15 in the morning and felt something that he had no quick name for. Not pride, exactly. Closer to the feeling of a weight bearing what it was designed to bear. Derek Patterson, Rubin's software guy, had taken 3 weeks to map the scanner integration gap and another 2 to build a proper fix with the vendor's cooperation. And when the fix went live, the East Line had stopped requiring the 40-second manual intervention that had been quietly bleeding the hub's numbers for 18 months. It was a small thing in isolation. Across a full shift, multiplied by the volume that line processed, it was the difference between a hub that was failing and a hub that was working. That was almost always how it went. Not one large fix, but a series of specific small ones, each of which mattered to the people who'd been living with the problem, and not at all to anyone reading a summary from 22 floors up. The personnel situation at Hub 1 that Ethan had been preparing for since week 3 finally came to a head in the 9th week. The shift supervisor there was a man named Glenn Murdoch, 51 years old, 17 years with Arcturus and its predecessor company, 3 commendations in his employee file, and a pattern over the last 2 years of running his team in a way that was producing acceptable output numbers while quietly burning through people. The turnover on Murdoch's shifts was running almost double the hub average. Exit interviews, which Ethan had read going back 18 months, showed a pattern, management style, communication problems, not heard, that had been noted and not acted on because Murdoch's efficiency numbers were fine, and addressing a management culture problem was harder than reading a metric. Ethan went to Hub 1 4 times before he had the conversation because he'd learned, in the Navy, in the warehouses, in every context where people were managed, that you didn't go into a conversation like this with a conclusion. You went in with evidence and a willingness to be wrong about what it meant. He wasn't wrong about what it meant. He sat across from Murdoch in the Hub 1 operations office on a Tuesday afternoon, and he laid out what he'd observed and what the exit data showed, and he was direct about it without being punitive, because the goal was not to punish Murdoch, but to give him an accurate picture of what was happening on his shifts and what it was costing the people who worked for him. Murdoch's first response was defensive. My numbers are fine, the turnover is a market problem, everyone's losing people right now, which Ethan had expected and let run without interrupting. Then he waited. You done? Ethan said. Murdoch looked at him. I've been doing this for 17 years. I know. That's in your file too. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying you're a bad supervisor. I'm saying that something in how you're running your team is making people leave. And when people leave, we lose what they knew. And that costs us more than anything your efficiency numbers are gaining. That's not an opinion. That's the math. Murdoch was quiet. I need to know if this is something you're willing to work on, Ethan said. Because if it is, I'm willing to work on it with you. If it isn't, we have a different problem. Another silence. What would working on it look like, Murdoch said. Not conceding, asking. Starting with the people still on your team. Sitting down with them, not a group meeting, individually, and asking what's not working, not defending, just listening. He paused. You might not like what you hear. I've been supervising longer than some of these kids have been alive. I know. And experience is worth something, but it's not worth more than being willing to hear a 24-year-old tell you something you've been getting wrong. Ethan sat back. I had a senior enlisted tell me I was wrong in front of my team once. In the middle of an op. He was right. I didn't enjoy it, but I'd have made a worse call without him. Murdoch looked at the table for a long moment. He was not a man who showed much, in the way of some men his age who'd learned to keep it internal, but Ethan had learned to read what happened in the spaces around what people showed. I'm not promising it fixes everything, Murdoch said finally. I'm not asking you to promise anything, Ethan said. I'm asking you to try. The turnover on Murdoch's shifts didn't disappear. It was better by the end of the 4th month, meaningfully better. And 2 people who'd put in transfer requests withdrew them, which was not a resolution but was a direction. Ethan took it as one. Pourquoi? The board officially tabled the restructuring proposal at the April meeting, and Victoria sent Ethan a message afterward that said simply, tabled, not dead. But we bought time. Good work. He read it at his desk and thought that bought time was probably the most accurate way to describe anything in this kind of work. You didn't resolve problems at this scale. You moved them in a direction and kept moving them, and tried to make sure the direction was the right one. She stopped by his office later that afternoon, which she did occasionally now, not regularly enough to create an expectation, but enough that it wasn't unusual. She sat in the chair across from his desk and looked at the view, which was the city and the river on clear days, and just gray light on days like today. Holt is going to bring it back, she said, next fiscal year when we're in budget planning. I know. If the numbers hold through Q3, he'll have less ground to stand on. Numbers have to hold through Q3 then. She looked at him. You sound very calm about that. I'm not calm about it, he said. I'm clear about it. Those are different. She considered that. She had a habit, he'd noticed it over the weeks, of sitting with things he said that she found worth sitting with, not responding immediately, giving it the space it needed. He'd started noticing it because it was rare. The Delaney team, she said. Carl's crew. Do they know how close it was? The restructuring? Carl knows. I told him in week 2 because I needed him to understand why the timeline mattered. The rest of his team, some of them probably suspect. People always know more than leadership thinks they do. Does it matter, them knowing? He thought about it honestly. I think people work differently when they know something is at stake versus when they're just clocking in. Not better, necessarily, sometimes worse if the pressure is wrong, but differently. More deliberate. He paused. Carl's team was already working hard before I got there. They'd been working hard for 18 months under conditions that weren't giving them much reason to. Knowing the direction is changing, that does something. She was quiet for a moment. When I sat on that bench in the park, she said, not looking at him, still looking at the city, I'd spent 14 hours being invisible. And what I kept thinking about the whole day wasn't how bad it felt. It was how easily it happened. You don't have to do anything dramatic to become invisible. You just have to be in a situation that makes ignoring you convenient. She paused. That's what the restructuring would have done to 430 people. Made ignoring them the convenient choice. He didn't say anything for a moment. That's why you were out there, he said. I needed to understand what it felt like, from inside it. Did it help? She turned from the window. You stopped, she said. So, yes, it helped. He looked at her for a moment. The CEO who sat on a park bench for 14 hours to understand something she couldn't understand from her desk, who had read his performance reviews more carefully than his own supervisors had, who had walked into a board meeting and used the word people the way other executives used the word assets and meant it differently than they did. She was not a perfect person. He knew that now, from 11 weeks of working alongside her, she was impatient in ways she sometimes didn't account for. She held her own counsel too tightly when she was uncertain, and it sometimes made her harder to read than she intended. And she had a habit of assuming that clear thinking was sufficient preparation for rooms that ran on things other than clear thinking. But she had sat on a bench in the cold for 14 hours, and she had remembered, and she had done something about it. You should let people know, he said. The Delaney team, not the experiment. Just that there was a proposal, and it's off the table, and why. She looked at him. You don't think that creates instability, letting them know how close it was? I think it creates something different, he said. Knowing someone went to bat for you and what it cost them to do it, that's not instability. That's the reason people stay. She was quiet for a long moment. I'll think about it, she said. He knew from 11 weeks that I'll think about it from Victoria Sterling was not a deflection. It was what it said. It was Lily who suggested going back to the park. She brought it up on a Saturday morning in late April at the breakfast table with no particular lead-up. She'd been eating toast, and he'd been reading something on his laptop, and she said, We should go back to that park, the one with the bench. He looked up. Calder Park? Where we met the bench lady, Victoria. She said the name with the ease of someone who'd heard it enough times at the dinner table that it had become a character in a story she already knew. Can we go? He thought about it. There was no reason not to. I'd have to ask her. You could just say we're going to the park and she could come if she wants. That's essentially the same thing. Lily picked up her toast. It's a nicer way to say it. He texted Victoria that afternoon. Lily wants to go back to Calder Park. She said I should tell you you're welcome to come if you want, which is apparently a nicer way of asking. He stared at it for a moment and sent it before he could overthink the phrasing. She replied in about 4 minutes. Sunday at 2 works, I'll be there. He showed Lily the text. See? Lily said. Nicer. Sunday was warm in the specific way that late April sometimes got in that city. Not summer, not even close, but the kind of warmth that felt like a promise after a long winter. The air holding a quality of light that made everything look slightly more deliberate than usual. He and Lily walked to the park because the weather warranted it, and because Lily wanted to look for the duck family that had apparently taken up residence in the pond, according to Priya from school, whose mother jogged the park path on weekends. Victoria was already there when they arrived. She was sitting on the bench, the same bench, which was either coincidence or not, in jeans and a light jacket, her hair down, no blazer, and she looked in a way that took Ethan a moment to adjust to, like a person rather than a CEO, which of course she always had been, but which was easier to see outside the building. She stood when she saw them coming. Lily, who had been walking at a normal pace for the entire trip, accelerated the last 30 feet and arrived in front of Victoria with her backpack still on and said, "Hi, I'm the one who wanted to come back." Victoria looked at her. Something in her face did the thing it had done on the bench the first time. Started to soften and then went further than starting. "Hi, Lily." "I remember you," Lily said. "You said your name was Victoria." "I did. My dad didn't tell me you were the boss of his company until later." "Lily," Ethan said. "It's fine," Victoria said. She was smiling now, the real one, the one that escaped. He didn't know either. They sat on the bench, the three of them, the same configuration as the first time except warmer and easier, the park doing its April thing around them. Joggers, a dog pulling its owner toward the pond, 2 kids on bikes taking the path too fast and correcting at the last moment the way kids on bikes always did. Lily spotted the ducks almost immediately and announced this loudly, and then asked if she could go closer to the pond to look, and Ethan said, "Stay where I can see you," and she went. He and Victoria sat in the middle of the bench with the empty space on either side where Lily had been, and the afternoon moved around them. "Does it look different?" she said. "Coming back?" He looked at the path, the pond, the bench beneath them. "A little," he said. "Everything looks a little different when you know what came after." She was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about that day a lot. The experiment, what I thought I was going to find versus what I actually found. What did you think you'd find?" "I thought I'd find that people were indifferent, which I did. That part was accurate." She paused. "What I didn't expect was what it felt like to have someone stop. Not the gratitude of it, just the weight of being seen by someone who had no reason to stop." He looked out at the pond where Lily was crouching at the edge, watching the ducks with the focused intensity she brought to things that interested her. "She's the one who noticed you first," he said. "Lily, I would have walked past." Victoria looked at him. "I'd have noticed," he said, "but I might have kept walking. She's the one who slowed down." "You're the one who stopped." "Because she already had." He watched Lily extend her hand toward a duck that was absolutely not going to come closer. "She's been doing that her whole life, slowing me down when I'm about to walk past something." Victoria looked at Lily too. "She's something," Victoria said, quietly, without the usual precision in her voice, just saying it. "Yeah," Ethan said. "She is." They sat with that for a moment, with the ducks and the light and the sound of the park doing its warm afternoon things. "The Delaney team," Victoria said. "I told them. Last Thursday. Carl and the shift leads first, then a floor meeting. I told them there had been a proposal to restructure the hub out of operation, and that it had been tabled, and why." He looked at her. "How did it go?" "Carl cried," she said, "which I was not prepared for." "Carl's a crier," Ethan said. "He cried when the conveyor fix came in on schedule." "He didn't tell me that." "He wouldn't. He's a very stoic crier." She laughed. The real one again. The one she didn't produce. "2 other people told me things had been different since you started coming out there. One woman said, she said it felt like someone finally noticed they existed." He looked at the pond. Lily had given up on the duck, and was now examining something at the water's edge with the investigative focus of a scientist. "That shouldn't be unusual," he said. "Noticing people exist." "No," Victoria said. "It shouldn't." But it was. They both knew it was. The world ran largely on the convenient fiction that systems could be evaluated in the aggregate, that numbers represented something real, that the distance between leadership and the floor was a feature rather than a failure. He'd spent his whole working life watching that gap operate. In the military, in the warehouses, in every organization where the people who made the decisions had stopped being in the same room as the consequences of those decisions. He didn't know how to fix that at scale. He was one regional director at one company, and the Delaney hub was one hub, and Carl was one shift lead, and the 40-second scanner gap that Derek Patterson had fixed was one problem in an industry full of 40-second gaps that nobody had assigned to Derek Patterson to solve. He knew that. But he also knew that the things you could do mattered in proportion to whether you did them, not in proportion to whether they solved everything. That was something he'd learned slowly, across years of trying to hold a scope large enough to fix what was actually broken and discovering, repeatedly, that the scope that worked was smaller than he'd wanted it to be and more specific and more human. You fixed the conveyor. You had the conversation with Murdoch. You sent the data package to Whitfield. You told Carl's team what was at stake. You did the thing in front of you, and then the next thing, and you didn't mistake the smallness of each individual action for insignificance. That was the lesson, if there was a lesson. He was wary of lessons. They had a way of making complicated things sound clean, but that one he'd come back to enough times that he'd stopped arguing with it. Lily came back from the pond and sat between them, slightly damp at the knees from crouching at the water's edge. "There are 7 ducks," she announced, 5 adults and 2 that are smaller. Priya said there were babies, but those aren't babies. Those are just shorter ducks. "Adolescents," Victoria said. "What?" "Adolescent ducks. Not babies anymore, but not fully grown." Lily considered this. "Does that mean they're awkward?" "Probably," Victoria said. "Most things are at that stage." Lily seemed satisfied with this. She looked out at the pond from the bench, sitting between them with her damp knees and her ladybug backpack still on because she never remembered to take it off, and the afternoon light fell across the 3 of them in the way that afternoon light in late April fell. Gently, without drama, the kind of light that didn't call attention to itself. "I like this bench," Lily said. "Me too," Victoria said. Ethan said nothing because nothing needed adding. He thought about the termination letter that had once been folded in thirds in his jacket pocket, which was now in a drawer at home, which he had not thrown away and was not sure why. Maybe because things that had been hard deserved to be kept, if only to remind you that the distance between that moment and this one was real and had been crossed. He thought about $43 and the food cart operator and the brown bag with napkins, and the way Victoria had said, "You don't have to do that," and he'd said, "I know," and both of them had meant exactly what they said. He thought about Lily at the breakfast table that morning, eating toast, saying we should go back to that park, with the same matter-of-fact certainty she brought to everything she'd already decided. She hadn't asked him whether it was a good idea, or whether Victoria would come, or whether enough time had passed. She'd just said it was time to go back. She was usually right about those things. She'd been right about the bench, and the eggs, and his jaw, and what it meant that Victoria had remembered. He looked at her now, sitting between them, watching the pond, 7 ducks and 1 bench, and a warm afternoon in April, and thought that whatever he'd done right in his life, she was the largest part of it. Not because he'd done it perfectly. He'd done it tired and scared and wrong in specific ways that he'd spent years trying to correct. But he'd done it present, which was the thing that turned out to matter more than any of the rest of it. He'd been there. He'd stopped. He'd sat on the bench. That was the whole of it in the end. Not the title on the door or the numbers moving at Delaney or the vote that went 8-4. Those things mattered. He wasn't romantic enough to pretend they didn't. But underneath them, carrying them, was something simpler and harder than any of it. The choice, made repeatedly and without guarantee, to stop when stopping was inconvenient. To see what was in front of you rather than what was convenient to look at. To treat people as though they were worth the cost of your attention, because they were, because they always had been, because the world that said otherwise was wrong in a way that could be proved with a park bench and $27 and a 7-year-old who hadn't yet learned to walk past. The ducks moved on the water. The light shifted the way it did in late afternoon, going gold at the edges. "Dad," Lily said. "Yeah, I'm hungry." Victoria made a sound beside him. Not quite a laugh, more like the thing before it. "There's a food cart at the park entrance," Ethan said. "I know," Lily said. "That's why I said it." He stood up, and Victoria stood up, and Lily was already moving toward the path, her backpack bobbing, her shoes, new ones now, same ladybug design, same lights, blinking pink against the pavement. He looked back at the bench once, just once. Then he followed his daughter into the afternoon, and Victoria fell into step beside him, and the park moved around them the way parks moved on warm April days, easy and indifferent and full of ordinary life. And none of them said anything for a moment, because the moment didn't need it. The cart was where it had always been. The sandwiches were still better than they had any right to be.